Ted Bundy is widely known as one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Using his intelligence, charm, and seemingly normal appearance, he managed to approach and gain the trust of many young women before brutally murdering them. Authorities later linked him to the deaths of more than 30 victims across several states in the United States. But what drove Bundy to commit such horrifying crimes, and how was he eventually captured? Those questions are explored in this video, which summarizes the Netflix documentary series Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. The documentary follows the long and complicated investigation carried out by police, journalists, and investigators who tried to uncover the truth behind Bundy's crimes. Alongside the investigative story, the series also includes recordings of Bundy himself speaking about his past while he was on death row, waiting for execution. During that time, Bundy agreed to speak with journalists under a specific condition. He wanted someone to write a book about his life. In exchange, he promised to provide detailed information about the crimes and the events surrounding them. To gather these materials, journalist Stephen Michaud conducted dozens of interviews and recorded nearly 80 hours of audio conversations with Bundy. At first, the interviews were extremely difficult. Bundy refused to confess and avoided giving direct details about the murders. He consistently denied responsibility for the crimes. Eventually, Michaud came up with a strategy that changed the entire conversation. Instead of asking Bundy to talk about himself directly, he suggested discussing the crimes in the third person, as if they had been committed by another individual. Surprisingly, this approach worked. Bundy began describing the crimes in detail, and through these recordings, investigators and the public gained a disturbing glimpse into the mind of the killer. To understand how Bundy became such a notorious criminal, it is important to look at his early life. Ted Bundy's real name was Theodore Robert Bundy, and he was born on the 24th of November, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, United States. His childhood was complicated and filled with confusion about his family background. His birth certificate did not list his father, and for many years, Bundy believed he had been born out of wedlock. Not long after he was born, his mother separated from his father and struggled to raise him. Bundy later claimed that he experienced emotional instability during childhood, especially within his extended family. Some accounts suggest he endured strict and sometimes abusive treatment from relatives, which may have influenced his personality and emotional development. In later recordings, Bundy even mentioned that his violent fantasies began forming at a young age. He said that certain magazines and disturbing materials he encountered during childhood played a role in shaping his imagination and behavior. As a young boy, Bundy was described as intelligent but socially awkward. He often had trouble making friends and interacting with others. Teachers and classmates recalled that he sometimes frightened other children during school activities or outdoor trips. He struggled with simple tasks and frequently showed signs of frustration and anger. However, things appeared to change when Bundy reached adolescence. During his teenage years, he became more confident and began presenting himself as ambitious and charismatic. He became involved in school activities and even developed an interest in politics. Some people who knew him at the time believed he might eventually pursue a career in public service. Despite his intelligence, Bundy was never considered academically exceptional. After graduating from high school in 1966, he enrolled at the University of Washington. While studying there, he completed a short academic program related to psychology, but his true ambition was not psychology. Bundy dreamed of gaining influence and power, especially through politics. During his time at university, he became involved in political campaigns and volunteer work. These experiences allowed him to meet influential people and learn more about how political organizations operated. In 1973, after finishing his studies at the University of Washington, Bundy attempted to enter law school. However, his academic record was not strong enough to gain admission to a prestigious law program. Instead, he enrolled in a smaller night school law program, which lacked the prestige he had hoped for. Around this time, Bundy was also involved in a relationship with a woman from California named Diane Edwards. Their relationship eventually ended, partly because she felt Bundy lacked the financial stability and maturity she expected. For Bundy, this breakup seemed to deepen his feelings of insecurity and resentment. Not long after, strange and disturbing events began to unfold. In the summer of 1974, police in Washington state received reports of female college students mysteriously disappearing from the area around the University of Washington in Seattle. Another young woman disappeared nearby shortly afterward. Over the following months, more missing person reports were filed. At first, investigators had very little evidence. The cases were treated as isolated disappearances because there were few clues connecting them. However, the number of missing women continued to grow, causing fear among students and residents in the region. Young women became increasingly afraid to walk alone. Many began traveling in groups to avoid becoming the next victim. The media quickly became involved and started questioning local police about the growing number of disappearances. At that time, law enforcement had little experience dealing with serial killers. In fact, the concept of a serial murderer was not yet widely understood within police investigations. As a result, authorities struggled to connect the cases or identify a clear suspect. Meanwhile, Bundy continued moving through society unnoticed. According to later evidence, he even worked briefly at a crime prevention hotline, assisting callers who needed support or advice. This detail shocked many investigators later, because Bundy was essentially working near the same systems designed to prevent crime. Investigators also discovered that Bundy had participated in projects related to crime prevention education. Ironically, this may have helped him understand certain weaknesses in law enforcement procedures. One of the most significant turning points occurred during a large outdoor event at Lake Sammamish in Washington. The event attracted more than 40,000 people, most of them young adults enjoying a summer day by the lake. In the middle of this crowded gathering, Bundy managed to approach several women using a carefully planned method. He pretended that his arm was injured and placed in a cast. Then, he would politely ask young women for help carrying items to his car. This tactic lowered their suspicion and allowed him to lure victims closer to his vehicle. On that day, 2 women disappeared. However, Bundy made a critical mistake, because the area was full of witnesses. Several people remembered speaking with a man who introduced himself as Ted. They also described the suspicious situation involving his injured arm and the request for help near his car. These witness accounts allowed investigators to create a composite sketch of the suspect. For the first time, police had both a visual description and a name connected to the mysterious disappearances. And from that moment, the investigation into one of America's most notorious serial killers began to move forward. After the incident at Lake Sammamish, police released the suspect's description to the public so people could remain alert and potentially recognize him. The sketch and details were broadcast on television and published in newspapers across the region. About a month later, investigators received a surprising tip from Elizabeth Klopfer, who was Ted Bundy's girlfriend at the time. Elizabeth had started noticing strange things about Bundy that seemed to match the description of the suspect shown on TV. While looking through his belongings, she reportedly found several unusual items: a pile of women's underwear, a bowl filled with different house keys, some plaster powder, and a knife hidden inside the car he used. Concerned and frightened, Elizabeth contacted the police and suggested that they should take a closer look at Bundy. Despite the tip, the investigation did not move forward immediately. After weeks of questioning and reviewing the evidence, investigators struggled to directly connect Bundy to the disappearances. Even when witnesses from the Lake Sammamish event were shown Bundy's photograph, several of them insisted he was not the man they had encountered that day. With very little physical evidence available, the case eventually reached a dead end. Authorities had no choice but to slow down the investigation. Publicly, police stated that they would continue monitoring the situation and that the suspect would eventually make another mistake. Their hope was that if the attacker struck again, he might finally be caught in the act. For a while, everything seemed to quiet down. As time passed, many people began to forget about the mysterious disappearances. But Bundy had not stopped. Soon, new attacks began to occur, and this time, the crimes became even more shocking. In one case, Bundy murdered the daughter of a local sheriff in the town of Midvale, Utah, where he had been living and studying. Around the same time, 2 more young women vanished from the area. During another attempted attack, a woman named Carol Durant managed to survive. She escaped after realizing something was wrong while Bundy tried to lure her into his car. By the time investigators began reviewing the pattern of cases more carefully, it became clear that the crimes were not isolated incidents. Bundy was eventually linked to a series of murders involving young women across several states, including Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Florida. Between 1973 and 1978, authorities believe he killed at least 30 victims. Bundy was finally arrested in Colorado during a routine traffic stop. A police officer had attempted to pull him over, but Bundy refused to stop immediately and tried to flee. After he was detained, investigators discovered suspicious items inside his car that connected him to several unsolved cases. This arrest eventually tied him to the growing list of disappearances. While awaiting trial, Bundy made headlines again by doing something almost unbelievable. During a court hearing in Colorado, he managed to escape from the courthouse. Bundy had secretly been practicing jumping from high places in his jail cell to prepare for the attempt. When he saw an opportunity, he stepped near a window in the courthouse library, opened it, and jumped out before running toward the nearby mountains. The escape shocked authorities across the country. For several days, Bundy managed to hide in the wilderness. However, after 6 days on the run, he was captured again and returned to jail. But the story did not end there. A few months later, Bundy escaped once more. This time, he created a dummy in his bed, using blankets to make it look like he was sleeping. Then he climbed through a ventilation opening in the ceiling of his cell and made his way through the building. After finding civilian clothes inside the jail, he simply walked out the front door. Following his second escape, Bundy traveled to Florida, where he committed several more violent crimes. Eventually, police arrested him again in the city of Pensacola after a high-speed pursuit. At that time, forensic technology was still relatively limited, which made investigations much more difficult. Bundy was known for trying to avoid leaving clear evidence at crime scenes. However, investigators finally discovered one crucial piece of evidence that would later become famous in the case: Bundy's bite marks. Dental experts compared the marks found on one of the victims with Bundy's teeth, and the results were presented in court as forensic evidence. On the 24th of July, 1979, Bundy's murder trial began in Florida. The trial became a historic event because it was one of the first criminal trials in the United States to be broadcast on television nationwide. Millions of viewers watched the proceedings unfold. Bundy made another surprising decision during the trial. Instead of relying completely on his lawyers, he chose to participate actively in his own defense. His legal team had advised him to consider negotiating a plea agreement that might spare him from the death penalty. At the time, Florida still carried out executions using the electric chair. Bundy refused the deal. He believed he could defend himself and challenge the prosecution's case. Unfortunately for him, his legal strategy was weak, and the evidence presented against him was overwhelming. During the trial, Bundy often behaved strangely in the courtroom. At one point, he even pointed toward the judge and spoke in a way that many observers described as arrogant and disruptive. This behavior did not help his situation and appeared to damage his credibility in front of the jury. The most damaging evidence came from the forensic comparison between Bundy's teeth and the bite marks found on one of the victims. Combined with witness testimony and other evidence, the prosecution was able to build a strong case against him. After reviewing the evidence, the jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours before reaching a verdict. Bundy was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to death in the state of Florida. In the following years, Bundy received additional death sentences for other crimes, including the murder of a 12-year-old girl in Florida. Altogether, he was sentenced to death 3 separate times for 3 different murders, although investigators believed there were many more victims connected to him. Even after receiving the death penalty, Bundy remained on death row for several years, while his lawyers attempted to delay the execution through appeals. During this time, Bundy also attracted attention for another unusual reason. Somehow, he managed to father a child with a woman who visited him while he was in prison. In the early 1980s, the FBI also became interested in Bundy from a psychological perspective. Investigators wanted to understand how a serial killer like him thought and behaved. They hoped that studying Bundy's mindset could help law enforcement better understand and track similar criminals in the future. During interviews with federal agents, Bundy admitted disturbing details about his crimes. In one statement, he even said that he had returned to visit some of the bodies of his victims. In 1986, Bundy's lawyers attempted another strategy to stop the execution. They argued that Bundy might suffer from severe psychological disorders and tried to use mental health arguments to delay the death sentence. At that time, research into mental illness and personality disorders was still developing, and some experts suggested Bundy could have conditions such as bipolar disorder or other serious psychological issues. However, these claims were largely speculative and were not supported by strong clinical evidence. Although the legal team managed to delay the execution for several more years, the appeals ultimately failed. Finally, on the 24th of January 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. By that time, he had spent nearly 10 years on death row. Outside the prison, thousands of people gathered to witness the moment from a distance. Some even celebrated when the news of the execution was announced, reflecting the intense emotions the case had generated across the country. The crimes committed by Ted Bundy left a lasting impact on the American justice system. His case pushed investigators to improve forensic methods and develop new approaches to criminal profiling. In some ways, Bundy's case helped law enforcement understand the psychology of serial killers and the warning signs that might appear long before crimes escalate. Even decades later, the story of Ted Bundy continues to raise difficult questions about human psychology, violence, and justice. What do you think about the case of Ted Bundy and the punishment he ultimately received?